The auctioneer's gavel hung in the air. In the back row, a man in oil-stained coveralls raised a paddle. $500. Beside him, a 7-year-old girl in a purple cardigan clutched a notebook to her chest, watching the rusted 1967 Mustang slumped against the far wall. The VIP section laughed. Caroline Voss, sharpest suit in the room, founder of Voss Automotive Group, locked her eyes on him and pitched her voice across the hall. $500. What exactly do you plan to do with that pile of scrap? The laughter swelled. The man did not flinch, did not look away. He kept staring at the car the way a doctor stares at a patient he has already decided to save. 30 days later, the entire city of Claremont fell silent. What happened inside that garage on Birchwood Street? The Claremont Heritage Auto Auction had been running 3 hours before James Calloway raised his paddle, but he had decided on the bid 3 days earlier in the kitchen of the small house on Birchwood Street, with a catalog open on the table and a pencil between his teeth. Lot 22. The page was creased where his thumb had returned to it. A 1967 Mustang Fastback 2-door original 390 V8 hauled out of a rural Tennessee storage shed after 22 years of stillness. The catalog photograph showed something most men in the hall would not call a car. Sheet metal blistered to the texture of old bark. The paint somewhere under all that was a color the catalog listed as uncertain original spec, not verified. James had verified it. He had been verifying it for 3 years. The folder in his canvas bag held a build sheet, a window sticker, and a notarized title transfer from 1988. The VIN on the window sticker matched the VIN stamped on the firewall in the photograph. The original color code spelled out a single name, Acapulco Blue, his grandfather's car. The car Walter Calloway had been forced to sell in 1988 when his wife was dying upstairs and the hospital had stopped accepting promises, and a stranger from Knoxville had pulled into the driveway with cash in an envelope and driven away with the only thing the family had ever bought new. Walter had never said he regretted it. He had been raised in a generation that did not say such things. But James had watched the way his grandfather looked at old Ford brochures the rest of his life, and that was the same as a confession. In the back row of the hall, James rested his hands on his knees. They were a working man's hands, now cracked at the knuckles, a thin, pale line across the base of the right thumb from a slipped wrench 2 years back. But the men who knew him from another life would have recognized them anyway. Those hands had rebuilt a 1934 Packard for the Smithsonian. They had restored a Ferrari for a private collector in Monaco, a restoration an independent appraiser had once called the most technically and historically honest work seen in 15 years. His colleagues at Hargrove Classic Works had called him the doctor because he could diagnose a failing engine from 45 seconds of idle. That was a different man. That man had missed his daughter's 3rd birthday because a client in London needed a verdict on a Bentley before Christie's would catalog it. And 4 years ago, that man had buried his wife on a Tuesday afternoon, and on the Friday morning that followed, had walked into the Hargrove office, set down his keys, and asked for the address of the smallest reputable garage in his grandfather's hometown, Claremont, Ohio. Population 31,000. He had not regretted it for a single day. Beside him sat Maisie. Her cardigan sleeves were pulled over her wrists, and a notebook the color of grape candy lay open on her lap. The notebook was new each fall. The pen was always purple, because that had been her mother's favorite color, and because, at the age of 7, she had not yet decided to want anything else. She was writing in tidy block letters under the printed lot description, and James could see from the corner of his eye that she had drawn a small star next to Lot 22. She did that when something mattered. She had asked him on the drive over why this car. He had told her the truth in the version a 7-year-old could carry, because it used to belong to her great-grandfather, because her mother had loved the idea of finding it again, because some things were worth going to get even when other people thought you were foolish for going. Maisie had written that down too. He had not told her the other thing. The thing Beth herself had said to him in the kitchen of a different house a few months before the accident with his grandfather on her mind. "We have to find that car someday, James. Not for him. For Maisie. So she'll know where you came from." He had agreed without quite agreeing. 4 years later, he had stopped thinking of it as a promise and started thinking of it as a debt. The VIP section sat under a raised dais near the auctioneer lit with warm bulbs that flattered the faces of men who had flown in on private planes for the weekend. Champagne flutes, wool jackets, the unhurried postures of people for whom $400,000 was the entry price of a conversation. Caroline Voss sat at the center of that section, in a charcoal suit, cut close at the shoulders, one hand resting on a leather catalog folder embossed with her company's mark. She was 41 years old and had built the Voss Automotive Group out of a single dealership her father had left her on the verge of bankruptcy. She sponsored the auction. She sponsored the vintage showcase across town. She sponsored, in fact, most of the things in Claremont that involved an engine and a price tag. 8 years earlier, she had written a check for $4 million to a man who called himself a heritage restorer on the strength of credentials that turned out to be fabricated for 3 pre-war coupes that turned out to be fiberglass shells with their VIN tags filed and reapplied. She had never recovered the full amount. She had never spoken about it publicly. What she had done instead was develop over the 8 years that followed a sharp and unforgiving instinct toward any man who claimed competence while wearing the wrong clothes. Most days, the instinct made her good at her job. Some days, it made her cruel, and she knew it, and she had not yet figured out how to put it down. The gavel of the previous lot fell. The auctioneer turned his microphone toward lot 22, and a young man in a blazer wheeled the Mustang into the staging area on a steel dolly. The car did not roll. The rear tires had cracked years ago, and the dolly groaned under the weight. A small ripple of amusement moved through the room. "Opening at 500, the auctioneer said in the bored voice men use when they have already decided a lot will not sell. James lifted his paddle. The amusement in the room sharpened into something else. Heads turned. In the VIP section, Caroline looked up from her catalog, and for half a second, her face did the thing it always did at the start of these episodes, the small, bracing motion of a woman about to defend territory she had paid for in pain. She spoke before she had decided to speak. $500? Her voice carried clean to the back of the hall. What exactly do you plan to do with that pile of scrap? The laughter that followed was the laughter of 100 people who had been waiting for permission. It went on for several seconds. A photographer in the press box turned and took a picture. In the VIP section, a man in a green tie clapped Caroline lightly on the shoulder, the way men do when they want to associate themselves with a winner. James did not turn his head. He kept his eyes on the car. Maisie reached across the armrest and held his thumb in her small fist, the way she did at the dentist. She looked up at her father and asked in the careful, quiet voice of a child who had already understood more than the adults in the room. "Dad, are we still buying it?" "Yes," he said. The auctioneer glanced once at the VIP section, then back at James, and raised the gavel. "Going once, going twice," it came down. "Sold. To the gentleman in the back for $500. James lowered his paddle. He stood, gathered his canvas back, and took his daughter's hand. They walked down the center aisle together at a steady, unhurried pace. And at the edge of the VIP section, Maisie said something not to her father, and not exactly to the woman in the charcoal suit either, but loud enough in the thinning room that several people heard it. "My mom said this car used to belong to my great-grandpa." Caroline Voss heard it. She did not move. She watched the small girl in the purple cardigan walk past her chair and out the wide double doors at the back of the hall, and she sat very still in her seat for a long moment afterward, holding a catalog she was no longer reading. Somewhere across the room, A server lifted a tray of empty flutes. The murmur of the auction was already moving on to lot 23. The tow truck deposited the Mustang on the cracked concrete of the garage at the end of Birchwood Street late Monday afternoon, and for the first full day after that, James Calloway did not touch a single tool. He sat on an overturned milk crate 10 feet from the bumper and looked at the car the way a man looks at a relative he has not seen in 20 years. Under the hard fluorescent tubes, the damage was worse than the auction lighting had let on. The paint had blistered from the roof, down in sheets, leaving the steel beneath the color of a dropped penny. The right front quarter panel had taken a side strike at some point in the last 2 decades and never been pulled back. The carburetor, when he eased the air cleaner off late that first evening, was packed with the kind of varnish that came from gasoline, sitting still through 22 summers. The timing chain was slack enough to feel through the valve cover. The valve cover gasket itself had crumbled into something more like old chewing gum than rubber. What he found underneath, though, was the part he had not let himself hope for. The frame was straight. The floor pans were original, scaled with surface rust, but unperforated, free of the Bondo a careless restorer would have packed in. And the 390 FE block, when he turned the crankshaft by hand with a breaker bar, broke loose and rotated through a full revolution with the resistance of an engine that was hurt but not killed. He sat back down on the milk crate and looked at his daughter, who had come to stand in the open bay door holding a juice box. "It's gonna come back," he told her. "It's hurt, but it's gonna come back." Maisie nodded the careful nod of a child who had heard her father say that about other things once. She wrote something in her purple notebook and went back inside to start her homework. Late that night alone, James pulled the driver's side door panel and felt along the bottom of the cavity where the original window crank assembly sat. There, folded into a tight square and pressed flat against the bottom of the steel, was a page from a fuel logbook in his grandfather's handwriting. 3 entries. Midsummer of 1973. The last one read in Walter's neat schoolteacher hand, Fairfield Sunoco, 87 octane $6.40 wipers replaced. 2 months before Walter's wife had first gone into the hospital. 2 months before the long unraveling had begun. He held the page under the lamp for a long time. Then he folded it back into the same square and slid it into the pocket of his shirt against his chest, where it stayed for the rest of the restoration. Trevor Mills came by Wednesday morning. He stood in the doorway with a thermos of coffee in one hand and a wrench roll in the other, looked at the car, looked at James, and crossed the garage to hang his jacket on the nail behind the workbench. "Weekends, evenings, holidays," Trevor said. "I'm not taking money for this. Don't insult me by offering." James did not argue. The two of them had worked side by side in the back rooms of Hargrove Classic Works for 9 years, and Trevor was the only man in Claremont who knew what James had been before he had been a small-town mechanic. He was also the only one James trusted to keep that knowledge in his pocket. By the end of the first week, the engine was out of the car and lying open on a stand in the back bay, every gasket replaced, every bearing checked, the cylinders honed to the limits of the original bore. They had been working in 12-hour stretches, and James had been sleeping on the couch in the front office on the nights Maisie stayed at her aunt's. On the 8th day, Maisie came down to the garage after school, with her cardigan unbuttoned and her notebook tucked under her arm. She did not get in his way. She sat on the milk crate her father had used that first day and watched him work the linkage on the rebuilt carburetor. After several minutes, without looking up from her notebook, she asked the question she had been turning over since the auction. "Dad, why did that lady at the auction say bad things about you?" He set the linkage down on the fender mat and wiped his hands on a shop rag. He thought for a moment about the answers he could give a child, and then he thought about which one Beth would have wanted him to give. "Because she hadn't looked carefully yet," he said. "Some people look fast and then they talk. Some people look for a long time before they say anything. I want you to be the second kind." Maisie nodded the small, careful nod again. Then she opened her notebook and wrote it down in purple ink in tidy block letters, the way she wrote everything that mattered. James watched her over the rim of the carburetor and felt the small, warm pressure in his chest that came whenever he understood freshly that he had not been wrong to give up the old life. Whatever the auction hall had cost him in pride, this was the trade. This, the chair in the back office, the juice box, the purple pen. While the engine was on the stand at Birchwood, Caroline Voss walked into Hartfield Auto Supply on 5th Street to pick up a special order distributor cap for a client's 1968 Camaro. She was wearing the same charcoal suit she wore most weekdays, and she was not in a hurry. The man behind the counter. Bill Hartfield had owned the shop since before Caroline had taken over her father's dealership. He was a broad, slow, friendly man who knew every classic car person within 50 miles and most of the gossip that traveled between them. He was also half deaf in his right ear, which meant he tended to speak louder than necessary and forget what was a secret and what was not. While he rang up her order, he gestured toward the far aisle where a man in a dark canvas jacket was comparing 2 replacement fuel pumps against a worn paper invoice. "That's your auction friend over there," Bill said in the same voice with which he had just announced the total. "The one bought the rust bucket for $500. Funny Smithsonian called this shop 3 years back, trying to find him for a Packard consultation. Christie's in London too for an Aston Martin. The man could have gone anywhere in the country. He chose here. People are something, aren't they?" Caroline did not turn her head right away. She finished signing the credit card slip. She picked up the small paper bag with the distributor cap. She made small, polite noises at Bill that did not mean anything. When she did finally glance toward the fuel pump aisle, James was already at the register. Too overpaying in cash, his face turned away from her. She walked out into the parking lot and sat in her car for 10 minutes with the engine off. That night, she stayed at the office past 11, with the door closed and the blinds drawn, and she put through a request to her assistant for the full professional file of one James Calloway. By the time the file landed in her inbox at 20 past midnight, she had moved a bottle of bourbon from the cabinet to the desk and had not yet poured any of it. The file was thicker than she had expected. There was a letter of recommendation from a senior curator at the Smithsonian on letterhead dated 2015. There was an independent appraisal of a Ferrari restoration in Monaco, written by a man whose name she recognized from auction houses, that called the work the most technically and historically honest restoration in 15 years. There was a magazine clipping she had read herself when it was published 6 years earlier, about a 1934 Packard at the Smithsonian, and there in the second-to-last paragraph named as lead restorer was the man she had publicly called a fool in a hall of 200 people. She read it 3 times. The 4th time, she went and got the file she kept locked in the bottom drawer, the file she had not opened in 4 years. The check stubs, the 3 lab reports on the fiberglass shells, the notarized statement from her own attorney. $4,712,000. The man who had taken it from her had worn an Italian suit and had a website that ranked first on every search engine. He had not looked like a mechanic. She put both files on the desk side by side and looked at them for a long time. She wrote an email to James Calloway at the contact address listed on the auction registration. She wrote 3 sentences. She read it back. She deleted it. She wrote 1 sentence. She deleted that too. In the end, she closed the laptop without sending anything, and the next morning, she made a single phone call to a man on the selection committee of the Claremont Vintage Automotive Showcase and asked him a question about Lot 22 from the Heritage auction. She did not give her reasons. The man on the other end did not ask. By the end of the week, an invitation had been mailed to a small house on Birchwood Street, and the woman who had arranged it had not signed her name to it anywhere. The engine went back into the car on day 15. It fired on the 2nd crank. The lifters chattered for 3 seconds and then settled, and James and Trevor stood on either side of the open hood, listening to a 390 V8 idle for the first time in 22 years and neither of them said anything for the better part of a minute. The harder problem was sitting in a plastic-sealed photograph on the workbench behind them, and they both knew it. The original color of the car, Acapulco Blue, had been a Ford factory specification mixed by DuPont in 1967, and the exact DuPont formula had been discontinued from the catalog in 1991. 3 of the largest classic car paint suppliers in Ohio could deliver something close. Close was not what James was after. Close meant the car would read to any restorer who knew the mark as a respectful approximation. Honest meant the car would read as itself. On the 16th day, he climbed up into the attic of the Birchwood house and pulled down the canvas duffel he had not opened since the week he had walked out of Hargrove. Inside, it was a 3-ring binder, 8 inches thick, with the original DuPont color formulas his department had compiled over 20 years of restoration work. He found Acapulco Blue on page 47, with the spectrophotometer readings stapled to the inside of the sleeve. Trevor borrowed a calibrated spectrophotometer from a paint chemist he knew in Columbus and drove it back to Birchwood the same afternoon. For 2 days, on a section of the rear quarter panel that had been cut away and replaced with new steel, James mixed test patches and let them cure under controlled light. On the second evening, he held the latest patch up beside an old black and white photograph of the car, the one with Walter standing beside the front fender in a short-sleeved shirt in 1969, and even in monochrome the value was right. The grays matched. Under daylight the next morning, against the surviving original paint inside the trunk, lid the new patch, and the old were indistinguishable. He sprayed the first full coat on the evening of day 19. He sprayed the second coat on day 20. And on the morning of day 21, when the booth lights came up and he walked around the car with the slow attention of a man doing his own quality control, he saw what no client would ever have seen, and what every honest restorer would notice in a heartbeat. On the lower section of the driver's side door, in an area no bigger than the palm of his hand, the second coat had bloomed into a fine cluster of micro-bubbles. Solvent pop. He had not checked the humidity in the booth carefully enough the night before. The defect was minute. To a buyer in a parking lot it would be invisible. To the men who had taught him his trade, it would be a confession of carelessness. Fixing it the right way meant sanding the entire panel back, repairing the substrate, and respraying. 4 days of work. He had 9 days left. That night, he sent Trevor home early and stayed in the garage alone with the lights down to a single bulb above the workbench. He sat on the milk crate in front of the car and put his face in his hands. After a while, he reached for his phone and pulled up Caroline Voss's office number from the auction registration packet. His thumb hovered over the call icon for some seconds. The question he wanted to ask was not a question he could put into words. It was something nearer to what am I doing this for? Who am I doing this for? Is this what Beth meant when she said, "Go find it"? Or have I let one woman's mouth at one auction turn this into something it was never supposed to be? He set the phone face down on the bench. On the front seat of the Mustang, where Maisie had left it that afternoon when she had come down to bring him an apple, was the purple notebook. He picked it up. He opened it to the last page she had written in. Underneath the date in her tidy block letters, she had copied out the sentence he had given her in the garage 2 weeks earlier, the one about the 2 kinds of people. He read the page once. He closed the notebook. He put it back exactly where she had left it. He went and got the longboard sander down off the wall and started taking the door panel back to bare steel by hand, because that was the way the men who had taught him his trade would have done it, and because his daughter, who could not see him at that moment, was the only person in the world whose opinion of him he had any right to care about. He worked until 3:20 in the morning. When Trevor showed up at 6 with 2 paper cups of coffee, he found the door panel sanded clean and the booth swept, and he did not ask what had happened. He set one of the cups on the workbench, and he started laying out the spray equipment for the second attempt. The invitation from the Claremont Vintage Automotive Showcase arrived in the Birchwood mailbox on the morning of day 29. Center pad formal placement, a position normally reserved for cars, hand-selected by the showcase committee. James turned the envelope over twice, looking for a name, and did not find one. He had not applied. He had not been recommended by anyone he knew. He showed it to Trevor and to Maisie that night at the kitchen table, and Trevor said, "Good," and Maisie added a new column to the page in her notebook, where she had been counting down the days. 29. 1 star. 1 showcase pin drawn carefully in the margin. What James did not know, and what he would not know for some time, was that Caroline Voss had sat in her own office that same morning with the showcase committee's confirmation on her desk, and had told her assistant, in the same flat tone she used for quarterly reports, that this year she would attend the showcase from the public floor. Not from the VIP tent. I'll be on the floor with everyone else. The assistant had nodded the way assistants do when they have learned not to ask follow-up questions. The last thing was Trevor. On the evening of day 27, Trevor told James he had to drive to Cleveland for 2 days to deal with something for his sister. James did not look up from the polishing wheel. He nodded. He said he would manage the final assembly alone. Trevor took his jacket off the nail and left. He did not drive to Cleveland. He drove 12 hours south and west to a small assisted living facility on the edge of Tulsa, where a man named Walter Calloway had been living in a corner room since the previous spring. The room had a single window facing a parking lot and 2 photographs on the dresser, one of Walter's wife in 1966 and one of a curly-haired boy of about 8 years old, taken in front of a car whose color did not show up in the black and white print. Trevor sat in the chair beside the bed and laid 2 photographs on the blanket over Walter's knees. The first was of a Mustang on a lift at Birchwood Street, primed and partway through paint, with the unmistakable shape of the 1967 Fastback unmistakably itself. The second was of a small girl of 7 in a purple cardigan, sitting in the driver's seat of the same car, with her father's cap perched on top of her head and both her hands on the wheel. Walter looked at the first photograph for a long time, and then at the second one for longer. He did not speak. When he did finally speak, what he asked wasn't what Trevor had expected, but it was the only question that mattered. "Is it Acapulco, Blue Sun?" Trevor nodded once. Walter set the photographs down on the blanket with hands that had become unsteady in the last year. He looked out the window for some seconds. Then he said, in the voice of a man who had not asked anyone for anything in a long time, "Then I need to find my good shoes." The last adjustment was the idle screw on the rebuilt. Holly and James Calloway turned it a quarter turn at 2:15 on the morning of the 30th day, listened to the 390 settle into a smooth 800 RPM lope, and shut the engine off. The garage went quiet in the way only a garage can at that hour. Outside on Birchwood Street, the November air had turned cold enough to fog the small, high windows along the bay door. Inside, under the single working bulb above the workbench, the Mustang stood on its restored wheels, in a color that even in that yellow light was unmistakably Acapulco blue. He and Trevor Mills sat down on the concrete floor, with their backs against the metal of the tool chest. Neither of them spoke for the better part of a minute. Trevor had come back from Tulsa on Thursday night, and had not told James where he had been, and James had not asked, because there were things in a friendship of that length that did not require asking. "Beth would have liked it," Trevor said. James looked at the car. The shop rag in his hand had a smear of fresh chassis grease across it. He turned it over once between his fingers. "She always knew I'd come back for it," he said. "I'm the one who took a long time to figure that out." Trevor nodded the small nod of a man who had nothing to add. After a while he got up, washed his hands at the slop sink, picked his jacket off the nail, and let himself out the side door. James stayed on the floor for another few minutes, then stood up and went into the house to wake his daughter. Saturday morning came clear and cold. The drive from Birchwood Street to Claremont Convention Park was 11 minutes by the route James preferred, which avoided the worst of the patched asphalt on Madison Avenue, and he took the Mustang along it at 35 miles an hour, with his hand resting easy on the wheel. It was the first time the car had moved under its own power since before his daughter had been born. Maisie sat in the passenger seat with her seatbelt drawn high across her cardigan. In her lap, she held the black and white photograph of her great-grandfather in front of the same front fender in 1969, and folded against it the small square of fuel log paper in his handwriting that her father had let her carry for the morning. She did not say much on the drive. She watched the houses go past and listened to the engine, the way other children listen to music. The showcase staff waved them through the service gate at 9:20. The center pad of the main pavilion had been roped off, and a small placard had been set on a tripod at the front of the bay. Lot 22, 1967 Mustang Fastback, restored by J. Calloway, Claremont, Ohio. James eased the car onto the pad, set the parking brake, killed the engine, and got out to open the passenger door for his daughter. Within 20 minutes, a crowd had gathered around the car that the showcase organizers hadn't arranged and couldn't have arranged. People drifted away from other displays the way water finds the low place in a yard. Word moves fast at a vintage car event when the work is honest. By 10:15, the pavilion staff had stopped trying to keep the aisle clear. George Alderman came down the aisle just before 10:30 in a tweed jacket and a flat cap. He had been a senior collector on the East Coast for 30 years and had bought 2 cars from Hargrove during James's tenure there, and he stopped 6 feet from the front bumper and stood looking at the Mustang with the still careful attention of a man who knew what he was looking at. He walked around the car once. He bent to look under the rear bumper at the unrestamped frame numbers. He came around to the front and asked with a small nod toward the hood if he might. James lifted the hood for him. George stood at the open hood for 2 full minutes without saying anything. When he straightened up, he closed the hood himself with both hands, the way a man closes a book he has been reading carefully, and turned and held his hand out. "James Calloway," he said. "I'd been wondering what you were doing with yourself. I know now." He held the handshake 1 beat longer than men of his generation usually did. Then he stepped back into the crowd and let other people have their turn. Caroline Voss arrived at the pavilion at 10:45. She came in alone through the public entrance, wearing a navy coat over a plain gray sweater, the kind of clothes a person wears when she has decided not to be recognizable from 40 yards. She saw the crowd before she saw the car. She was 40 yards out when she registered the color. She came another 15 yards and stopped where she stood on the pale, poured concrete of the pavilion floor and looked at the Mustang in a way that emptied her face of the expression she wore in boardrooms. She came on slowly. The crowd parted for her without recognizing her, which was a thing she had not experienced in 8 years. By the time she reached the front of the pad, James was standing on the driver's side of the car, with one hand resting on the door handle, and Maisie was standing beside him, holding the photograph against her chest. Caroline opened her mouth to speak. She did not get the chance. From the far end of the pavilion, where the public entrance led onto the main aisle, an old man had come in through the doors, with another man at his elbow. The old man was wearing a brown suit that was a little big at the shoulders and a pair of brown leather shoes that had been polished that morning. He was walking with a cane. The man beside him was Trevor Mills. People in the back of the crowd noticed first. The old man was walking with a particular sort of attention. His eyes had found the car from the far doorway, and they had not left it for the length of the aisle. 2 women near the rope stopped talking. A man with a press badge lowered his camera. The hush moved forward through the crowd, the way a small wave moves up a sloped beach 1 row at a time, until it reached the rope at the front of the pad. Walter Calloway stopped 3 steps from the front bumper. The pavilion, which a minute earlier had been full of the sound of voices and footfalls and the small mechanical hum of the lighting, was no longer making any of those sounds. No one had asked for the quiet. No one had announced anything. It was the kind of silence that arrives by itself when a great many people understand, at the same moment, that what is happening in front of them is not theirs to interrupt. Walter took one more step forward slow and put his hand flat on the hood of the car. He stood there, with his hand on the painted steel, and did not move for a long time. His eyes did not water, but the set of his shoulders gave him away for about 3 seconds, and then he straightened, lifted his hand from the hood, and turned to his grandson. What he said in a voice meant for 3 people, and only the 3 people standing nearest the front of the car heard it. Beth told me that if you ever went and found this car, you'd be the only one in the family who could do right by it. I didn't believe her. I'm sorry, I didn't believe her. James did not trust himself to answer. He nodded once and put his hand on his grandfather's elbow, and the 2 of them stood there for another few seconds, with Maisie between them, holding the photograph against her cardigan, and somewhere out in the crowd, a woman started to cry quietly, and a man cleared his throat, and the hush began to come apart at its own pace, like ice on a pond in March. Trevor brought a folding chair from the staff area. Walter sat down beside the front fender, with one hand still resting against the chrome, and let people approach him a few at a time, the way they had been approaching the car. Caroline waited until then. She did not step into the moment that did not belong to her. When the small circle around the front of the car loosened, she came around to the driver's side, where James was standing, and she stopped within speaking distance and waited until he turned to face her. She did not begin with an apology. She began with the truth. 8 years ago, she said, a man who called himself a heritage restorer took $4 million from me and gave me back 3 fiberglass shells with filed VIN tags. I never recovered the full amount. I have spent the 8 years since then taking that wound out on every man I have decided too quickly might be the same kind of man. I used you for that at the auction. That is not an excuse. It is the explanation I owe you. I am sorry. To you and to your daughter. James looked at her for a long moment. He did not answer right away, because what she had said had cost her more than the words showed, and any quick answer would have lessened it. It was Maisie who answered her in the end. She looked up at Caroline with the same steady consideration with which she watched her father work a carburetor, and what she said came out exactly the way she had written it in her purple notebook 2 weeks earlier. My dad says some people look fast, and then they talk, and some people look for a long time before they say anything. You're learning to be the second kind, so it's okay. Caroline took 5 full seconds to answer. When she did, all she did was nod once and step back. Whatever face she had walked in with had been put down somewhere in the last minute, and the woman left standing in its place was a person James found to his own surprise that he could imagine working with. The judging panel announced the Best Restoration and Best in Show awards at 12:30 in the afternoon. Both went to the 1967 Mustang Fastback on the center pad, with the highest combined score in the history of the Claremont Vintage Automotive Showcase. The trophy was handed to James, who handed it without ceremony to Walter, who kept it in his lap for the rest of the afternoon. Caroline came back once more before the show ended. She did not bring papers. What she said was that the Voss Automotive Group intended to open a heritage division in the spring, and that the division would need a director, and that she could think of one person in the state of Ohio she would want in the chair. James did not say yes. He did not say no. He told her his terms in the order in which they mattered to him. I stay in Claremont, and I come home in time for supper. Caroline nodded the small nod of a person hearing a condition she had already prepared herself to accept. That has always been the right condition, she said. The drive back to Birchwood Street took longer than the drive out, because the late afternoon sun was low, and James kept the speed at 30. Maisie fell asleep in the passenger seat halfway home, with the photograph still in her lap, and the small square of fuel log paper still folded against it. Walter rode in the back with his cane between his knees and his hand resting on the seat beside him, and he did not say anything the whole way because there was nothing left to say. At the house, James lifted his daughter out of the car and carried her inside and set her down on her bed. The purple notebook slid out of her grip onto the quilt, and he picked it up and laid it carefully beside her pillow. The last entry, written in tidy block letters on the drive home, read Day 30. The car came home. So did Dad. He turned the lamp off in her room and walked back out through the kitchen to the open door of the garage. Walter was standing beside the Mustang, with one hand resting on the roof, the way a person stands beside a thing he has given up on and been given back in the quiet of a man who understood that certain moments did not come around twice. James stood in the doorway and did not interrupt. The car had come home. The man who had brought it home stepped back inside the house, and the garage light stayed on a little while longer.